Okay, and now I'm going to start the webinar.
Right.
Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to the Transceiver Performance for HF, DX, and Contest Operator webinar. Your panelist for this webinar is Mr. Rob Sherwood. Please use the question and answer function to post questions. They'll be answered at the end of the presentation unless something needs to be mentioned right in the middle. Rob will provide his email at the end of the presentation if you'd like to contact him for further information. This webinar is also being live streamed on YouTube and is being recorded for later viewing. You can find information to access this and other videos on hamcation.com. And just so you know, your camera doesn't need to be on. Your microphone has been muted and will likely stay that way through the presentation. And with that, Mr. Sherwood, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. So I'm going to be talking about receiver performance and then something that's been added in the last few years, transmitter performance. Receivers are really so good today that the limitation on receiving a weak signal might be the other guy's transmitter that's nearby. So I don't want you to just focus on a few transceivers. I started testing receivers in 1976, and our choices today are just amazing. And we have several new challenges, so let's take a look. I get asked when people go to my website to look at my table of like 150 different transceivers and receivers, why don't I sort it by sensitivity or noise floor? And really the reason for that is it's really not an issue. If we go back to the R390A, which some of you may be well familiar with, 1954, the sensitivity on sideband was 0.2 of a microvolt. And the Drake R4C was 0.2 of a microvolt. And the Elecraft K3S with preamp number 1 on 0.2 of a microvolt. So you can see that's not really an issue for receiving weak signals. It's been, receivers have been plenty good for a long, long time. What is an issue is urban noise, RFI from all sorts of sources, and I'll mention some of those later. So the newer term for, in effect, sensitivity is noise floor. So how do we compare those? So sensitivity for sideband is a 10 dB signal plus noise to noise ratio in a sideband bandwidth. And I list this in microvolts because then we can compare it to something we had before 1975 or maybe our radio that we owned in the 60s or the 50s. But noise floor is a 3 dB signal plus noise to noise ratio, and we usually measure that in a 500 hertz CW bandwidth. So those three receivers that I gave you earlier, with the sensitivities the same, well, you can see the noise floors are almost identical. But local noise is really a problem today. I would say I've been here in Denver, Colorado since 1969, and I think the noise level in general has gone up about 3 dB per decade. It's certainly gotten worse. And what are those sources? Well, line noise, it seems like line noise isn't as maintained as well, the insulators and all that as well as in the past. Wall warts, well, we charge all sorts of things. They used to just be a transformer and a couple of diodes, but now they're a switching power supply, much lighter in weight, but they make noise. Of course, computers all have switching power supplies. And amazingly, household appliances now have microprocessors. It might be your dishwasher, your refrigerator, your washing machine, and those things put out racket. Sometimes LED light bulbs can make noise. And our DSL circuit or VDSL certainly can cause broadband noise. And then, of course, in some states, including Colorado, we have grow lights to grow pot, and those make terrible noise that can be as much as a mile away. So what is dynamic range? And really, we want to know how well can we receive a weak signal surrounded by strong signals and not have the receiver be making its own interference. And for a long time, for maybe 20 years, 25 years, we had upconversion radios, and they were really a compromise because their close-in dynamic range was about 70 dB, plus or minus a few. And maybe the first one of those was the Drake TR7, and the last one I owned was the Pro 3, the ICOM Pro 3. So pretty much upconversion radios are probably seen their day, except for the one, ICOM 7851. It's kind of pricey, but it is still an upconversion radio. But for most radios, if it's a CW contest, pileup, DXpedition, or RTTY contest, the upconversion radio sort of seen its days. And so what has come out in the last couple of years that do perform very well? We've got the new hybrid superhets, and I explained that. The new Kenwood 890S, the two new Yaesus, the 101D and the 10, and then direct sampling. And direct sampling in the last couple of years, of course, we've had the ICOM 7300 for about 5 years, but we've got the VHF UHF, and then the 705, which is a cute little radio for the soda guys or just someone you want to take a radio out and put it on a park bench. And then the Elecraft K4, which is just begin to ship to customers, not beta testers, but customers. I think we either have at least one out there now. So what numbers are important in a multi-signal environment? Now, if we just had one signal in the band, we wouldn't care. Close-in dynamic range, which is measuring it, what like a pileup would be on CW or a RTTY contest. The noise floor, even though I said you don't have to worry about it from being adequate, we need that number for the calculation of the dynamic range. Reciprocal mixing dynamic range, that's a new term from 2012 that the league coined, and it's the phase noise performance of your radio's local oscillator, or the clock if it's a direct sampling radio. Transmitted broadband noise, broadband composite noise, that means AM noise and phase noise. That doesn't get much press, but that can be a big problem. If we've got neighbors nearby, blocks away, a mile away, certainly on field day, transmitted composite noise is a big problem, as is reciprocal mixing dynamic range, particularly with the older radios. Well, of course, we all know what splatter is on sideband, so that's a limitation, and I'll show you some information on that. And then key clicks. If you're a CW operator in a contest or a DX pileup, that can be really annoying. So that's a problem too. So these new terms, noise floor and dynamic range, were defined in QST in Ham Radio Magazine in 1975. So how did they test them? Well, they fed in two equal strength signals into the receiver and increased those test signals until the third order distortion product was just peaking itself up above the noise floor of the receiver. Now, you're probably used to looking at transmitter amplifier information, either the exciter or a linear amplifier, and see distortion products in QST. So this is the same thing. It's the third order distortion product that's being generated in the receiver. So we adjust that so that that distortion product goes up 3 dB on an audio meter, an analog audio meter we're using hooked up to the transceiver. And so when it goes up 3 dB, just like when we were measuring noise floor that went up 3 dB for a 3 dB signal to noise ratio, that's the definition. And that means that distortion product equals the noise floor. So just as an example, let's say the noise floor of a transceiver was minus 128 dBm, and the two test signals happen to be minus 28 dBm. Well, the difference between those two is 100 dB, but that's just an example. Like the TS590SG, the difference between those two levels is 92 dB, so it can be any number. Reciprocal mixing dynamic range deals with how clean is the local oscillator or the clock oscillator in your direct sampling radio. And you say, well, why does that matter? I mean, we're not listening to the oscillator, but the trouble is that that can be transferred to the signals on the band. So let's look at this little bullet nose signal on the left of this graphic that I got off the web. And that's the guy we're trying to work. And maybe it's DXCC number 100, or maybe it's multiplier number 80, or whatever it is, you really want to work that guy. But there's a really strong signal nearby, and it can be a perfect signal. Of course, that doesn't exist, but let's just make it a perfect signal. But the noise on a local oscillator will mix with that strong signal and put sidebands on the strong signal, and those noise sidebands that came from the local oscillator may cover up the weak signal we're trying to work. Now, this graphic assumes that the noise on our local oscillator falls off fairly rapidly, and it might, and we certainly hope it does, but it may not. There's some transceivers where the local oscillator is just as noisy at 100 kilohertz or 300 kilohertz as it might be at 10 kilohertz. So we just don't know in that case. So I'll say the devil's in the details when you're trying to read product reviews. So when we look at some of the product reviews in QST, the first thing is, if there is one with a sidebar by Bob Allison, read the sidebar. He really tells a lot of useful information. And he described in more detail than I'm going to today what reciprocal mixing dynamic range is and why it's important in the April 2012 and the May 2016 issues. So if you're a league member, you can go download those issues. For a long time, the phase noise or the reciprocal mixing dynamic range dominated over our standard dynamic range, third order dynamic range measurement. So here's an example that's kind of worst case. It goes back to 2013, but it was the FTDX 3000. Now, in some advertisements that I read in magazines, it was claimed the dynamic range was 106. I don't know where that came from, but the league measured it as 100 dB, and that was kind of surprising to me because I had previously published worst case, because if it's dynamic range limited or reciprocal mixing, phase noise limited, I list the worst number and put a footnote if it was phase noise limited. Well, the way that the league measured that 100 dB, they used a spectrum analyzer with a very narrow filter, like 3 hertz or maybe 1 hertz. And they were able to measure that distortion product buried in 18 dB of phase noise. So that was kind of a bogus number from my standpoint, but they did have the RMDR number. It wasn't really defined back then in 2013 too clearly, but that listed in the same review at 82. And that's exactly the same number that I published on my website. So if we come a little more recently, the March of last year, in the review of the Zygu G90, it had the same issue, just not quite the difference. So the dynamic range measured with a very narrow bandwidth was 91, but the reciprocal mixing dynamic range measured in a 500 hertz bandwidth, which is the standard, was 84. So if you got two numbers and one smaller than the other, the smaller number is what really matters. As I said, read Bob's sidebars. In this case, he said it had mediocre CW keying sidebands, that's key clicks. IMD sideband splatter was mediocre, and the transmit phase noise was not too good either. So he cautioned, don't use an amp so you can run, several hundred watts with your G90. Now, if you go up on a SOTA site and you've got a piece of wire up in a tree, I'm not going to worry about it. So pay attention to the sidebars, and just pay attention also if you've got two numbers, if one is a lot bigger than the other, that bigger number is kind of nothing. We need to be a good neighbor. We have to share the bands, and we don't really want to transmit poor signals. The other thing that's a little confusing is blocking definition, and that also came up in the same issue of the G90. So blocking means gain compression. So both the league and I test blocking with a 1 microvolt signal in the preamp off, and we keep feeding in a signal that's off frequency. until the audio we're trying to receive with that 1 microvolt signal drops 3 dB. And we're going to just define that as the blocking. Well, in the case of this G90, the blocking was listed as 121, not great compared to a K3S, which is 150, but the RMDR at the same offset was 84. So the phase noise was 84. Well, the blocking at 121 was kind of meaningless. So you just have to pay attention. As I mentioned, the phase noise of your rig may dominate, and it did for a long time. However, there are several superhits now that are much newer, that's no longer a problem. We've really learned how to make synthesizers that are clean. If you have a K3S, it's great. If you have a K3, hopefully you upgraded your synthesizer. Of course, the expensive ICOM 7851 is excellent, but the two new Yaesu, the 101D and the 10 and the TS890S, they're super hits, standard, have a synthesizer in it, but they're excellent. Now, it's hard to goof up a direct sampling radio from this standpoint. All you have to do is have a clean clock oscillator. Every direct sampling radio has to have some sort of a reference oscillator, and as long as it's a good one, we're in good shape. ICOM, Flex, Apache would be the examples. So there's two basic types of transceivers today. The super hit, whether it's a hybrid or not. The K3 is not. The TS890S is, for example, and the direct sampling radios. So the super hit hybrid, it says normal super hit, but it has a direct sampling band scope that has amazing resolution. You can really see what's going on in the band, and you'll see some screenshots coming up in a bit. So they both work, and there's differences and some strengths and weaknesses, but they're excellent products that way. If we're at field day, or you've got a ham a few blocks away or a mile away, from a blocking standpoint, the radio with a roofing filter will have an advantage, maybe as much as 25 dB. I don't think most of the time that's a problem. Like at my QTH out in the country, I don't see signals S9 plus 75 or 80 dB over S9. But if I had a close neighbor, my closest neighbor is luckily only 13 miles away, not a problem. So what features are desirable today? Well, I'd say QSK, or at least semi-break-in. I usually run semi-break-in. That's a CW issue. The audio peak filter, APF, it reduces noise and fatigue. And I'm going to talk about fatigue issues coming up, because noise, when we're operating for a long time, particularly in a contest, or you're just straining to work that de-expedition for hours at a time, noise is a detriment. We want a band scope. Most all the radios today have one, or you can add it to some of them. We need an efficient user interface. We don't really want to have to be fumbling through a menu to change something simple that we might want to adjust when we're operating. We certainly need a rock solid connection to our logging program. And I happen to like the tuning knob if it's a computer controlled radio, but maybe you like your mouse. That's just up to you. So here's the lucky thing. The state of the art today for all brands of the major 6 brands is amazing for the receivers. You can have a dynamic range of 95 dB or higher. We'd like the reciprocal mixing, the phase noise dynamic range, to be better than the standard third order dynamic range, because all it takes is one signal nearby to potentially cause noise to end up on your signal. So we'd like that number to be bigger, and that's not a problem today. So the rigs with this kind of performance, the ICOM direct sampling, those 3, any of the Flex 6000, the Apache Anna, and I've tested the 7000 and the 200. I haven't tested the 8000, but I'm going to assume it's about the same. The K3S, or a K3 with a new synthesizer, the Kenwood 890S, the Yaesu 101D, and the 10. So if you have a brand that you've been loyal to the brand, you love the brand for all these years, you have no problem getting a radio today that's top-notch. Let me explain this chart here a little bit. This is the top 21 individual models on my website. It's not the top 21 starting at the top and just count down 21. And why is that? There's multiple samples in some cases. For instance, the K3 came out in 2008 and it improved over time. Also, the direct sampling radios are not as consistent as the superhet. So I've got 2 samples with some of the direct sampling. So this is the top 21 individual models. And look right in the middle of the pack, 100 dB. Wow. Can you imagine 30 years ago, we think I can buy all these radios, they're just going to be amazing. I even put the ICOM 705 in the list at the bottom because I used that in 3 contests. Sweepstakes, ARRL 160 CW, and ARRL 10 meters. That's an amazing little radio that's about the size of a brick and weighs about 2.5 pounds. So you've got all sorts of choices, which is fantastic. You can work DX and contests with any of these. And look at the price range, $12,000 or more to $1,000 for new. And what did the current pricing do to the used market? It's even a better bargain. Of these 21 radios, I've used 15 of them in at least one contest and sometimes more contests. For instance, the TS590 series I mentioned a little bit ago, N2IC is a big contester and he used a pair of 590s. So you don't have to think I've got to spend a fortune to be competitive. It comes down to other things like location, antennas, and operator skill. So what's the elephant in the room? The K4, as I said, we now know that at least one is out to a regular customer, and so they're going to be ramping up shipment. Well, we don't know the performance. I haven't tested it yet. Of course, the league hasn't tested it yet, but we do know the architecture. The standard K4 will have one ADC, analog to digital converter, and one set of bandpass filters. And the K4D will be double that. It'll be architecturally like a ICOM 7610. It'll have 2 receivers, 2 ADCs, and 2 sets of bandpass filters. So one would expect the performance to be similar. The K4 HD, no idea what it's going to cost. Maybe it ships to the end of the year. We'll see. It has roofing filters and heterodyne, so it's a super het like the FTDX 101D or the FTDX 10, but more to the point since it has 2 receivers like a 101. So that's going to have roofing filters and it'll be a hybrid. Pay attention to net gain. Now, what do I mean by that? And I'll show you in some coming slides. On 160 meters and 10 meters, which is kind of the gambit of our normal DXing and contesting, use common sense. When should you use a preamp? And I'll explain a way to know that for sure. And when should you use an attenuator? And I don't think a lot of people use their attenuator, but I'll explain why. I mean, if you're on 40 meters at night, using the attenuator makes sense and the preamp doesn't. But if you're on 15 meters or 10 meters and you're in a quiet location in particular, well, the preamp's certainly going to be your friend. Now, maybe urban noise negates some of that usefulness of a preamp. It just depends what your location's like. So I'm going to say the dynamic range, let's consider it a window. It's however big it is. Let's say it's 90 dB, whatever it is. And we can move that window up and down. If we're on the lower bands at night, we really should be considering using the attenuator for 2 reasons, which I'll explain. And if we need the preamp on the upper bands because it's quieter and maybe the signals are weaker, certainly with the sunspots the way they are, we're going to move that window down to get more sensitivity, but we might be overloaded. Probably not, but we could. So we can make it the best use of that window depending on what band we're on. And really, when we turn on an attenuator, the dynamic range doesn't change at all. It just moves it. If we turn on the preamp, if it's properly designed, it may not make any change, or maybe at worst 1 or 2 dB, nothing you'd ever notice. So the preamp and the attenuator are our friend. I'm going to show you 2 slides here from 2018 of 2 different contests. This is the 10 meter ARRL contest, and I was using a TS890. As you can see, there were over 20 stations, even though last year and the year before sunspots were awful, but there was still plenty of activity, a lot of weak stuff. So up in the upper right-hand corner it says preamp 1, so it's on. And in the lower right-hand corner, the audio peak filter is on to reduce the noise. I didn't need it necessarily for more selectivity, but it cuts down noise, and that cuts down fatigue. So that's how I operated on 10 meters. Here's the 160 meter picture of the ICOM 7610. Then now there's lots of information here, more than I imagined when I took the screenshot. Now in the upper portion of the LCD screen is the audio peak filters on. Okay, just like on 10 meters. Over on the left, attenuation, 12 dB. Well, that of course is just the opposite of 10 meters. Well, why can we do that? Band noise on 160 at night versus 10 meters during the daytime is 30 dB different. It's 30 dB noisier on 160 just in general, not talking about even an urban environment. So we've got sensitivity to burn. So we can turn on attenuation. Well, if we've got locals, and on 160, a lot of people use inverted L's or Marconi T's, so ground wave is tremendous. So we can have some tremendous local signals. Well, we can turn on attenuation to reduce the chance of overload, but we really want to do that for another reason. There's no reason for band noise to be running your AGC. All that does is make band noise in between stations as loud as every station you're working, and that's tiring. So let's say we're on 160 and we're tuned in between a station and we punch in our 6 dB attenuator. I bet nothing happens as far as reducing noise coming out your speaker or your headphones. Maybe we punch in 12 dB. Well, then maybe the band noise will go down a little bit, and that's a good place to start. Now with the 7610, which is what we're looking at here, we can get attenuation in 3 dB steps. So maybe I set it at 15 dB. So that's kind of nice. One year, there wasn't anything new to test in contests. So I pulled out the TS990S and the ICOM 7300. Now the 7300 only has one attenuator, unfortunately, and it's 20 dB. So I had the attenuator on at 20 dB, and I had the TS990S at 18 dB, as close as I could set them. Now that was the first time I'd done that at that much attenuation, and you know what? I loved it. It was amazing. Now every once in a while, working a weak station, I had to turn the volume up. I wasn't having trouble with sensitivity, but because I'd set the Agc threshold high enough, some stations I needed a little more volume. But the rest of the time, when I was tuning between stations, the noise was almost not there. It was just marvelous, and the fatigue was much, much less. Well, what else did I capture here with this screenshot? Well, look at that CW signal on the left that says key clicks 5x. Look how wide he is. And if we look over on the right where it says clean, now that station's like 2 or 3 dB weaker, so that's insignificant. But look how narrow he is on the band scope, and particularly on the waterfall. Look at the difference in the waterfall with the guy on the right who has a nice clean signal, and the one on the left which has terrible key clicks. That's just awful. And then look at the left side of his key clicks. There's a little tiny signal trying to peek up through his key clicks. You can see it on the band scope, and you can see it on the waterfall. So if I wanted to work that guy, I'd have to be trying to copy him through those key clicks. So we really shouldn't have key clicks like that. And I'll explain how we can get rid of them on most rigs today. Well, what about on sideband? Well, you know, our transmitters aren't as clean as you'd like, and you'll see some spectrum analyzer shots in a bit. But pure signal is something that Apache has, and it's pre-distortion. Now, pre-distortion is used in the cell phone business and the TV transmitters. What it does is kind of like inverse distortion. Well, I was actually talking to the station on the right that says pure signal, and look how his signal is just straight up and down. Now, he happens to be an enhanced sideband guy. His bandwidth was over 4 kilohertz on purpose. I wouldn't do that, but the point is, look how straight up and down. There's no fuzz or wings on his signal, but the guy down the band, look at that splatter. So if you're tuning around with your transceiver today that has a direct sampling band scope or it's a direct sampling receiver, you can tell who's on an Apache and who's not if they've got the pure signal turned on. It's like night and day between those two. That's great. And it may be coming to other radios near you, Flex and the K4. At some point, hopefully they'll have that. Okay, I talked about how do you adjust your attenuator until the band noise drops a little bit. What do we do for our preamp? Well, we'll call it antenna noise gain. The way to do it right is to have your dummy load available on an antenna switch, however you want to do that. You can do an open circuit, but hook up your dummy load. And maybe we've got an external switch where you've got an external one on the rig that we don't use. So let's go to 10 meters. And these data points come from two 5-element Yagis at height. So with the preamp off on 10 meters, as I went between the dummy load, which then I'm just going to be hearing receiver noise, and I of course put a piece of test equipment on the speaker so I can measure it in dB, but you can just listen in your ear. And I flip it between the dummy load and the antenna with no preamp, and the band noise only went up 3 dB. That means the receiver is making half the noise. Half the noise is band noise and half the noise is coming out of our radio. Well, we don't want that. But if we turned on preamp 1, went between the dummy load and the antenna, it went up 9.5 dB. That's tremendous. The noise from the receiver is minimal. 6 meters, similar but worse. Without the preamp, we could hardly even hear the antenna connect. Preamp 1, still not enough. Probably a third of the noise is from the radio, but we go preamp 2, and it's almost 10 dB. Great, so we got it made. So here's the screenshots of a spectrum analyzer on several radios to explain transmit splatter, transmit out order product. Now every amplifier has it. Some are better than others. This is the cleanest transmitter I've ever owned. Collins 32S3. Been out of production for a while. So what you do, you feed in these two test signals. They're equal strength, just like you see in QST reviews. And you put one cursor of your test analyzer on one of the two signals. They're the same. And then you put the other cursor on either third, fifth, seventh, or ninth. In this case, you can see it's on the third. And if we go in the upper right-hand corner, you can see that distortion is down 36.5 dB. But that's the way that we measure it correctly. That's called DBC, dB below the carrier, or in this case, dB below those two tones. For whatever reason, I guess because people like big numbers, the ads and the reviews all talk about PEP, and that adds 6 dB to the number. It doesn't change the distortion, but it makes the number 6 dB bigger. Okay, fine. I call it a feel-good number. It'd be kind of like switching your speedometer in your car from miles per hour to kilometers per hour. It's going to make it a bigger number, but we wouldn't be going any faster. So the other thing to look at is how soon do these distortion products fall away? Now we're looking at an 80 dB range here. So 80 dB is way down, but if we look at this Collins, plus or minus 10, which is half the span, this is plus or minus 20 for the whole span of the picture, plus or minus 10, it's gone. That's tremendous. Here's the second cleanest transmitter that I've owned. That was a TS990S, 50 volt PA, which you would hope is cleaner. In this case, it is cleaner. On average, I say a 50 volt PA is 5 or 6 dB cleaner. But in this case, it was only 2.5 dB cleaner compared to the Collins for third order. But look, it doesn't fall off as fast. Instead of falling off at plus or minus 10 down 80 dB, it's falling off about plus or minus 18 dB. So there we see the solid state, not quite as clean as the tube. Well, here's a K3. Now it's 9.5 dB worse on third order. And you can also see that plus or minus 20, it's not down 80 dB yet. Well, what's really the point of this slide? To explain why on sideband, we lived with all those up-conversion radios that were 70 dB, more or less, maybe 68, maybe 75, but around 70. On CW, that really wasn't adequate. On RIDI, that wasn't adequate. But on sideband, here's the deal. Let's say the guy that's calling CQ contest incessantly has splatter products that are down 45 or 50 or even more dB 4 kilohertz away, where the red arrow is pointing down. Well, a TS590SG has a 92 dB dynamic range. Well, here the splatter's down 40, 50 dB. So you can see the receiver was not the limit on sideband very often if we had a signal a few kilohertz away. CW, a different story. Speaking of CW, we would hope that we could work a weak signal a kilohertz away from a strong one. Maybe that's that multiplier that you really want. Well, rigs today allow you to adjust the rise time and the fall time, and they give you choices that are terrible. They let you pick 1 and 2 milliseconds, which is awful. They shouldn't even let those be an option. Elecraft won't let you do that. It's fixed. So anyway, look at the difference in keying key clicks between selecting 1 millisecond rise time on this Kenwood or 6 milliseconds. At 1 kilohertz offset, the key clicks are 25 dB worse at 1 millisecond. So you're not being a good neighbor. So go into your menu and pick 6 kilohertz or maybe even 8 if it gives you that option. Some of them go from 2 to 8, some from 1 to 6. So be a good neighbor. Transmit composite noise doesn't get much press. We don't hear about it much. It certainly shows up in field day. Certainly can show up if a station's nearby. So look at the 3 examples here. An Elecraft K3S, really good at 10 and 100. 7610, well, not as good at 10, but virtually identical at 100, so that's good. Then we've got the 3000 that I was mentioning earlier. Well, it's not good at 10, and it doesn't get any better at 100. So that would be a really poor choice. So let me give you a real-world example. There's a ham in Boulder, Colorado that lives up in the foothills. That means he's overlooking the entire city of Boulder, like 5 miles away. There's a couple guys, this gentleman in particular and one that's got a stacked beams. They both like 15 meters. When he used to have his FT 1000 MP, he didn't bother the other station that was 5 miles away line of sight. But when he switched to the FTDX 3000, the 3000 virtually wipes out a couple hundred kilohertz or more of the phone band. So that's just not being a good neighbor. So luckily, the better rigs today don't do that. I don't know if you read my article in QST, November 2019. The league titled it, "It's Time to Clean Up Our Transmitters." A tip of the hat to the league for emphasizing that our OEMs now need to look at the transmit side. They've made receivers better and better. They're just tremendous today. Transmitters haven't improved, and in comparison to my old Collins, they're worse. So take a look at the article if you can download it and see what we're talking about. They also, in the same issue, tested the Expert 1.5K FA linear amplifier. Now, it had your typical third-order distortion products of a LDMOS amplifier of -30 PEP. Okay, we'll just go with the PEP. That's what appears in the magazines. But they turned on pure signal from that Apache, and the distortion went down 17 dB better, from 30 to 47. So if we could all do that, can you imagine how much less splatter there'd be on the bands? So let's quickly look at solid state amps, which I say are not so linear. The league published in 1997 a list of tube amps, and the third order products were all down 40 to 50 dB PEP. Well, the KPA 1500, -30 right out of QST. The Power Genius that we tested, -30. The Expert that was just in that QST review, -30. Well, my TS990S is -40. So that means if it goes through an amp that's making it 10 dB worse, that's too bad. Of course, once pre-distortion becomes more available, we can clean up our amplifier, not just the exciter, but the amplifier too. Real quickly, the last slide or two, QST has started publishing the input-output curves, and this is useful. On the left, here's the Elecraft. It happens to be the blue line on the left, and you can see it's pretty straight. Begins to curve down a little bit above 1,000 watts, but it's pretty good. But then we've got the ACOM 1200S. In this case, 20 meters is in red for whatever reason, and it's straight up to about 700 watts, and then it goes to heck. So I would not run this ACOM 1200S over half power because your splatter will be significant. So bottom line, receiver performance from all the 6 major OEMs is amazing. The limit today in a pilot might be broadband noise, and I'm using noise generically, splatter noise, key click noise, broadband composite noise. So that's where we are. Sometimes it's not your radio. There's my email address, rob@nc0b.com. I can send you a PDF of this or answer questions after the fact. And there we go. We got a little time for some questions. Are we there?
Hi, Rob. This is James Enzer, XIA. Your moderator lost his internet connection, so I took over. Was he handling the QA for you?
We didn't do any, so he was going to handle it. So yes, if there is a Q&A there, go for it.
Okay. From Carl Davis, your comments about local noise are very true. Do you have any way of rating which radio has a better digital noise reduction and other filtering to help with that? And he says, thank you so much for this great webinar. So I think he's asking, do you have a chart that people could see on the performance of the different brands out there?
I mean, there's two things. There's transmit noise, and I do have some data on that. As far as noise reduction, that's very subjective and it depends on your type of noise. So I don't have any comparative data on noise reduction, except to say that the Apache noise reduction written by Warren Pratt, NR0V, has some amazing noise mitigation capability that he's programmed into that radio, and other OEMs hopefully will follow suit. If you want to get an example of that, go to nc0b.com/NR0V. That's his call. Rob, no, don't, no, just, no, Rob. nc0b.com/NR0V. There's 2 audio clips there. It'll knock your socks off.
Alrighty. Next question is, I used RF gain to reduce noise. How does that technique compare with using the attenuator on lower bands?
Okay, that's okay. It will vary though. It probably works better on the super hits because as you turn the RF gain down on a typical super hit, the S meter goes up and it quiets the gain across the entire chain. So it's going to maybe reduce the gain at the RF amplifier or maybe a mixer and maybe the last IF stage. So it's going to quiet the radio. So if you take an older, don't say older, a super hit radio, if you turn the RF gain all the way back, the radio probably goes totally silent, zero noise. So if you're going to use the RF gain instead, in that case, fine. But on the direct sampling radios, it's different because they don't necessarily provide the attenuation the same way. So like with a 7610, it's in the front end and you turn it back and back and back. Well, the noise that's in the latter part of the radio doesn't go away. So I'm happier using the attenuator because I know how much I'm doing it. But if you don't get carried away, you can do either one.
All right, next question. Rob, your listings and analysis are extremely helpful. What type of ham station can likely see a difference between a DR3 of 100 dB with a modern SDR and a DR3 of 105 to 110 with the best of the best?
I would say, I understand. I would say no one can tell the difference.
Okay, and go on.
Yeah, go ahead.
He's got more than one question here, and he says, do you need a station with stacks and Yagis to see what type of difference, or is most of this non-discernible for the average contester and DXer?
Okay, so years ago, I used to say if it was 80 dB, and even W8JI said that 80 dB was probably adequate for most of us most of the time. And then receivers got so much better, I'd say 85 or better is probably fine most of us most of the time. But of course, most isn't always. You may well find that an 80 dB radio is noticeably not as distortion free is your 100 dB radio. But we don't want to get fixated on the 110 dB radio versus the 100 dB radio, because almost all the direct sampling radios are about 100 dB. And most of the time it's fine. At WRTC in Germany, what is it, 2 years ago, every brand and type was used. I think that the people with the 7610 maybe were running like 9 dB of attenuation on 40 meters, but that's fine. We're not giving up anything by putting some attenuation in on 40 meters or 80 meters or 160 meters. Now, the reason I put that ICOM 705 in that list of 21, I ran it in 3 contests. I wasn't running QRP. I was writing legal limit in all 3 cases with amplifier, but I was really seeing how does this little radio that you can hold in your hand compare, and it worked really well. So we're at the point, I think, and I think Wayne said this yesterday on his presentation from Eldercraft, that we've got so many choices that are going to be just fine for most of us. Most of the time, it's going to come down to features, reliability, firmware updates, bug fixes, long-term cost of ownership. One of my radios, I'm struggling right now how to get it fixed because it could cost a lot of money. So we got lots of choices, and you can really do well with all of them.
All right. This looks like a miracle question. It says, what can we do with our TX equalizer to be good neighbors? Is there anything we can do to mimic that pure signal pre-distortion technology with our current transmitters settings?
Unfortunately, no. Now, I certainly run EQ on my any transceiver I'm running. I'll put more high boost on, maybe a little bass cut. It just depends on your voice, of course, and your microphone. But that's going to optimize the copyability, but it will not have any effect on the splatter. Now, that being said, if you don't use any EQ and you have sort of a muffled sound like this, well, then you're not going to splatter as much because the highs aren't there, because the highs really are what makes the width of our signal. But go ahead and EQ, make your signal as intelligible as possible, and let's hope that we see pre-distortion with more than one company in the coming years.
My 7610 was worse during field day with nearby signals overloading me than the 7300. What column in your chart would indicate best performance to prevent overload?
Well, I wish I knew a little more detail on that, because really the performance of the 7300 and the 76 are similar, and the 76 even has a tracking pre-selector, but they both, it wouldn't be my first choice to take to field day comparison to a radio with a roofing filter, just because of the blocking or ADC overload. Now that says nothing about the transmit composite noise. So maybe this gentleman could come back with a little more detail in his question, because I'm really surprised that the 7610 performed worse, unless the guy had the preamp on or something in comparison. Maybe it was a net gain not set up right.
Okay, well, that was from Steve Ellington. He could type something in the QA section if you give you more information. All right, the next one. How dirty or clean is Eldercraft 500 watt? That's a little dirty in the English. How dirty or clean is the Eldercraft 500 watt power amplifier?
Okay, it's probably a little bit cleaner at 500 watts than the 1500 is at 1500 watts, because there's more headroom. I think you can get about 650 watts out of a KPA 500. So if you're going to run it at 500 watts or 450 watts or something, the odds are it'll be a little bit cleaner. Not a lot, but I haven't seen an LD Moss amp yet at legal limit that's knocks your socks off. So, and then the other issues with the tube amps, which are cleaner, we're not talking about sweep tube amps, but good tube amps, the cooling fans are so much quieter. So we've got 2 things right now to deal with the solid state amps. But of course, everybody likes an amp we don't have to tune. So it's a trade-off.
All right, well, I must have missed this part of the webinar. so maybe you can understand it. He says, speaking of fatigue, when operating, can or do you measure acoustic noise from a rig such as fan noise?
I do. Now, I think the amplifier noise is a bigger problem, as I just mentioned. I mean, if you're really going to it on a RTTY contest or something, or even a CW contest, your amplifier blower noise, if it's solid state, may really be a bit annoying. I don't think most of the rigs are that loud, and you're probably contesting with headphones, although on sideband, I don't always. So it's an issue, but it's less of an issue than optimizing the Agc threshold. You really need to set that Agc threshold above band noise, whatever amount makes sense to you. That's the biggest thing.
Okay, I'm not sure if this is a question or a statement. He says AGC settings and quieting 120 hertz line noise with noise blanker. Maybe that guy was responding to something you said, I'm not sure.
Yeah, not really sure. I mean, obviously line noise is annoying, and it's difficult with software blanking to take out line noise if there's lots of signals on the band.
Yeah, I thought noise blanker was where it's like another part of the IF that's measuring a common noise with the main frequency you're listening to pulse it out or to null it out.
Well, if you do go listen to that NR0V clips, which were presented at Tapper about 3 years ago at Dayton when we still had Dayton, it's just astounding what kind of noise you can take out with today's technology, but it isn't as generically available as it is right now from Apache.
Okay, next question. The FTDX 3000D does not seem to fare well in your reviews. Given the number of users, same, what operating or setting adjustments might be recommended to get the most out of what we have to work with?
And this is the 101D you said?
No, the FTDX 3000 Delta.
Oh, the 3000. Okay, sorry. Well, the problem is it transmits noise and it has reciprocal mixing limitations, and you can't do anything about it. So that's just where we're just stuck between a rock and a hard place on that one.
Okay. I'm a new general. I was looking at both the 7300 and the Yaesu DX10. Is one more user-friendly than the other for someone new to the hobby without an engineering degree?
I would say a new ham should definitely not spend a fortune, and that just came up recently on a reflector that I made a post that a new guy, should he buy a $4,000 or $5,000 radio? And I say no. Well, obviously the 10 is a $1,700 radio. The 7300 is a $1,000 radio. I own a 10. I ran it in, what is it, last weekend or 2 weekends ago, CQ Worldwide 160 meter contest. And I found it annoying because there were ergonomic things that were deal killers to me. I use a waterfall to look for stations I'm going to work next. And any waterfall up until the 10 or the 101 stayed there when you transmitted. So if you called somebody, you didn't lose your waterfall. But the Yaesu waterfall disappears as soon as you transmit. So that drove me nuts. And the band scope's very jumpy. Now, that all said, did the basic radio work? It worked well. I ran semi break-in. I worked over 200. What did I work? I forgot the number of stations. Maybe it was almost 400 stations on search and pounce. I didn't call CQ. And so the radio worked well. But for me, it's up for sale. And just because of the way that the display works. So, and it's also 70% more expensive. So either one would probably be okay, but I hope that Yaesu fixes their band scope. There's no reason for it doing the nutty things it does.
Okay. Which transceiver is better for DX contacts, the TS990S or the TS890S?
Most of the time, the difference would be the display, which is fantastic on the 890. Close in, the phase noise of the 990 is significantly worse. Now, close in meaning 2, 5, 2 kilohertz, 5 kilohertz. If we get to 20 kilohertz, the 990 is fine. So if there was a station 20 kilohertz away, you wouldn't have an advantage. But I don't see a reason to buy a 990 today compared to an 890. The 890's has got performance advantage in every respect except transmit. The sideband signal is definitely 5 or 6 dB cleaner with the 990.
Okay. With a number of competitive contest stations using their Y signals to keep other stations away, well, he's kind of saying that they're doing that on purpose. I'm not sure, but okay. With a number of competitive contest stations using their Y signals to keep other stations away, how can they be convinced that they need to improve their transmit signal?
This is coming up. There's a discussion right now in particular about key clicks and that stations could be disqualified if they have terrible key clicks. Now in the 10-meter contest that I operated just second weekend in December, there were stations, one station was 35 kilohertz wide on key clicks, and I was able to find him. And another station was that wide or worse with transmitted noise and spurious, and I was able to find him, and I got their calls. So it's possible that on CW, if it happens, will be CW first looking at terrible key clicks, which does drive people away. And I think it's no question sideband operators, some, don't mind being wide to have shoulders to give themselves room. But if we do it for CW, then we should be doing it for sideband. So the only way it will happen is if you get yourself disqualified, you'll quit doing it.
That's a great idea. I wouldn't have thought of that one. Okay. The question is, what is the best amp on the market that you have tested? And if I could add a question to that, you can probably answer it, but do you have a chart that people could go to like what are the 10 best of whatever on the market type chart? Do you have something like that to help answer his question?
We're working on it. We've got about 6 or 8 amplifiers now, tube amplifiers, solid state. The solid states are all pretty much the same as you saw from that one slide. The tube amps are pretty much 10 or 20 dB better. I'd say my Alpha 89, which of course isn't made anymore, is the cleanest amp I own, and it's really good. So I will have a chart like that as we get access to more amps. But if you really like to have a clean amp at the moment, you really should consider a tube amp. Some of them are auto-tuned, some of them are not. Mine are all manual tuned. But at the moment, until pure signal comes down the road, because the amplifier can be in the distortion loop, correction loop, at that point, we can probably get away with anything. But right now, we only have one brand that offers pre-distortion.
Okay. This looks like a statement. I guess you were talking about the digicell. The so-called digicell made overload worse. It peaked up the local signals.
Digiselect is a tracking pre-selector. It's fairly wide. Also, there's VC tune for the Yaesu 101. I get people making comments that puzzle me. They say, well, I'm going to side tune the tracking pre-selector by hand, and it's going to drop noise. Well, the only way it can do that is to add insertion loss, because on 40 meters, the digicell is 500 kilohertz wide at -10. Plus 250, minus 250. So if you side tune it, it'll do what it does. So I don't see how. I think people are fooling themselves by fiddling with the tracking pre-selector. Now, is it useful? It cuts down signals out of ham band. So if you've got shortwave signals that are out of ham band, or shortwave signals above 7.2 on 40 meters, and you're on the low end on CW, the digicell and the VC tune are going to be helpful because it'll knock those down. But I'm getting strange reports that I think are just using it in a funny way.
A funny way?
Well, providing insertion loss when you could do it with your attenuator. I think it's providing attenuation when that could be done easier.
Okay. For the attendees that are listening to this webinar, I know some people are asking questions in the chat. I'm reading the ones out of the Q&A because they stay there. I'll try to get to the chat, but I'm working on Q&A right now. Okay, the next one. Attenuation didn't help with field day overload. The ADC was totally swamped on the 7610. With an Anon 7000 DLE, it totally ignored the local signals and worked perfectly. Again, which column indicates freedom from overload? Did you have a chart up?
Well, it's the dynamic range, of course. And you look at wide space or narrow space. With a direct sampling, narrow space should be virtually identical to wide space. So those numbers should be there. Well, it probably was a case of how we were adjusting net gain. I mean, any of these radios overloaded, the direct sampling radios, the Apache, the Flex, the ICOM, they overload about the same point, around minus 10 dBm for a signal way out of passband. Of course, you put in the attenuator, that makes it less overload. You put in a preamp, it makes it more. I would really pay attention to the how the gain was set. On the Apache, you've got a slider that adjusts the gain, and you've got on the 7610, you've got an adjustment in 3 dB steps if you choose, or 60 dB steps if you don't. And of course, you've got your preamp. So there's no magic, and the same will apply to the K4. There's no magic as far as overload. It has a certain dynamic range around 100, and you've got to just move that dynamic range window up and down to be optimize it for your RF conditions right now, depending on band and depending upon what the other signals are. Now, for a field day, I would certainly want bandpass filters on each band, but that doesn't help if you've got CW, FT8, and sideband all on the same band. Obviously, a bandpass filter there that's 400 kilohertz wide doesn't do anything. So in that case, your options are an up conversion radio with, a down conversion radio with roofing filters, or attenuation. That's just where we are.
Okay. Let's see. Will the average ham be able to hear a consistent difference between a 100 dB and a 95 dB, or a 105 dB receiver, assuming one tried to match settings and signal circumstances to be as close as possible?
I think the simple answer is no.
Okay. How does the adjustment of compression affect splatter artifacts in your TX signals?
That depends on the radio. I kind of have had a complaint with Yaesu, and I'm not so sure because I didn't get a chance to play with the 101 much. But I complained at Dayton Hamvention a few years ago that the speech processing had way too fast, and the ALC had way too fast a time constant. So it made splatter worse by a lot. So like with the 5000D, which has been out for a while, of course, and no longer in production, if I ran any ALC, it degraded the splatter significantly. I ran the 5000D on Class A, which of course you can't do anymore in a current Yaesu radio, and was driving this Alpha 89, and a guy stopped by and said, "I want to comment on your signal." And I thought, uh-oh. And he said, "I've got a K3 and a P3, and you have this cleanest signal I've ever seen." I was running Class A with 0 ALC. So the ALC was the culprit there. So some radios, the ALC ruins it, and some it doesn't. So it's very inconsistent from model to model or brand to brand.
Okay. I guess you've done some SDR work. It says, what would the dynamic range of an RMDR look like for a cheap RTL-SDR 8-bit dongle?
I think if you look at some of the QST reviews, that they've tended to review some things that I don't bother with, and maybe that's sort of I should, but they're more in the 60 to 75 dB range. And if you're mainly using them for a band scope, like you've got a TS590SG and you want a band scope, well, you put a dongle on it and off you go. So I think they're tremendous for that. But they're just receivers. Now there are obviously some that are QRP rigs that are, some are, I don't know if there's anyone except the new ICOM that's actually direct sampling. You've got direct conversion, which is like a 0 IF, or maybe an 8 kilohertz IF, like the KX3, KX, the FC is something out of Russia. But anyway, I can't think of the number. So there's lots of different architectures for some of the QRP rigs, but your dongles are not going to be tremendous, but use them for what they're meant for. your sniffer for RF, for maybe a noise in your local area, trying to figure out where the line noise is coming from, or you're making it as a band scope, or you're just using it to listen to shortwave, but they're not big numbers.
Okay, I'm pretty sure you already answered this one. Those of us that are still using tube high power amplifiers, they are cleaner than solid state amps, yes?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Now, we're not talking about sweep tube amplifiers, but the ceramic tubes, the 3500Zs, that type of stuff.
Okay. Did you test the G90? And is it on your list?
It's on the list to do. I've tried to borrow one from a friend, and it's tied up right now, but I will test it some way or another, hopefully within the next couple of months. It has been reviewed in QST, and as I mentioned, if you looked at those slides, Bob Allison had some negative comments like don't use it with an amplifier because of its limitations. But it's popular, and if you're on top of a mountain peak, I don't think the limitations are going to be a deal killer because it's only like $500.
Right. Any thoughts on the ICOM IC9700 versus other VHF, UHF all mode rigs for weak signal satellites?
Right. Well, I can't comment on satellites, but the dynamic range, I published a dynamic range on the 9700 on 2 meters of 74, and QST published it as 91. And in a presentation I gave in the UK a few months ago, and that could be, if anyone wanted to see that presentation in PDF form, it's maybe even if it's on YouTube, I'm not sure. I talk about that in more detail, but when we're measuring a direct sampling radio, we hope that the input output curve is relatively straight and monotonic, meaning it doesn't go up and down and up and down. Well, the 9700 goes up and down. So if you picked the sweet spot, as we call it, at 91 dB, that sounds great. But if we didn't pick the sweet spot, it was 74. When I gave the presentation in the UK and then people listening from Europe, they were really happy to see that graph of the non-monotonic input output curve, because one guy said, I use a 97, I use a K3 with a transverter, and he said there is no way the 9700 is a 90 dB radio. So that follows my testing. It's you're looking at smoke and mirrors if you think you've got a 91 dB radio. So it replaced my 275H. I love it. But if I was on the East Coast on a mountaintop with a 10 dBi antenna, let alone a 20 dBi antenna, and running a kilowatt, I'd be better off with a transverter and some clean HF rig.
Okay. Let's see. You made a distinction between the receiver step attenuator and RF gain. Isn't the RF gain on some radios like the 7300, 7610 a variable attenuator?
It is. And so if on the 7300 you got one choice, 20 dB. So you may or may not use it on 160. I used it. I wouldn't use it on 40 meters. The attenuation's about the same in the two ICOM cases. It's a pin diode in the case of the RF gain, and it's an attenuator as you select it with the either the 3 or 6 dB steps. So I'm not going to make a big distinction other than as I mentioned, as you keep turning down the RF gain on, let's say, a 7610, if you're expecting the radio to go absolutely quiet, it does not. And some people say it's noisy. Well, if you put in too much attenuation, guess what? I agree with that statement. So you just have to watch how much is turned down. One thing that was cute with the 705, when you start turning down the RF gain, it gives you a digital readout. It starts at 99, 98, 97, and you've got at least something you could go back to, and with a specific value that you can't do on the 7300 or the 7610. I would hope they'd fix that in an updated firmware so that feature is there. Now, it doesn't change the attenuation, but at least you know where you are, as opposed to, well, the knob is sort of here. And I like that improvement on the 705.
Updated question. Let's see. It's a long question. Let me read it a second. Okay. Apparently it's an updated question, which I can't remember what it was. But anyway, a friend and I were talking about your prior comments that a preamp isn't much use below 15 meters due to noise, and that's true. What do you think about a preamp use with a beverage or low noise receive antenna for the low bands like 160 meters or 80 meters? Does a preamp benefit signal more than noise, or is it just adding S units to the meter?
Oh, definitely a preamp for a RX antenna may well be required. Now, sometimes your preamp will be out there at the antenna, and sometimes it may not. So I definitely should have said, you're assuming you're using your transmit antenna for receive, you probably wouldn't use a preamp on 40 meters at night, but sure, if you've got an RX antenna, well, then you do the same thing. Switch between your antenna, your receive antenna, and your dummy load, and if the gain goes up, let's say 10 dB, then you're in good shape. So yes, you definitely need preamps for a lot of receive-only antennas.
Okay. Very broad question. You got any comments on flex radios?
Well, that's kind of a broad statement. Well, they brought direct sampling to the world, so tremendous for that. And I've used them several times, and they do well. I think software is our biggest bugaboo on anybody writing software for radios today, whether it's bugs or features or whatever. In the old days, you build a radio with parts and it worked. And now everybody has an SDR. Now I'm using it in the broad strokes, but you've got software, firmware in every radio that you could buy in the last, 5 years at least. So, and 6 years, I guess, in the case of Flex in 2014. So it's tremendous that we got there, probably because of Flex.
Okay, I guess I missed this one in the webinar, but I'm going to guess that what he's asking is you've tested several radios of the same model and found them not to be consistent, because he says, Rob, why are there such wide variations in some of the radios you have tested? An example would be the IC R8600. You measured the RMDR as being 11 dB different on 2 different rigs. Is there as much of a difference in manufacturing consistency?
It's not the manufacturing consistency of the radio, it's the consistency of the chip, the ADC chip. Now, the 8600 is I call it the worst example, the biggest difference between sample 1 and sample 2 in the dynamic range. I'd have to look at the RMDR, but the difference in dynamic ranges, I think, approaches 20. With linearization, and that would be IP plus for ICOM, and it would be dither and random for Apache. And with Flex, it's on all the time. It's done totally differently, but it's still linearization. So linearization makes more difference with some chips than others. And even in different brand radios, linearization can also raise the noise floor slightly, usually only 2 or 3 dB, in some cases almost none. But if you go back to the original, maybe 10,000 of the 7300s, the IP plus linearization dither raised the noise floor like 13 dB. So I just don't turn it on my old 7300, but my new 7300 doesn't have the problem. So the ADC chips are not like peas in a pod. So the variation is chip to chip, not the individual radio to radio. It really is the chip.
So it sounds like a quality control if you want to be consistent, I guess.
Well, I don't know there's anything you can do about it. I mean, the chips are turned out by the zillion,
right?
And it's got differences in the steps, and the linearization definitely helps. And I would say the typical variation with the linearization on is not that big a deal. It's probably 7 dB or something like that. And so if we're up in the range of 100 dB, if it's 95 or it's 100 or it's 103, I don't think we care. But there is more difference, no question, in each chip than there is in the old superhead.
Okay. Oh, this one's going to be fun. What are your favorite two rigs?
Well, I'll just tell you what I own, and I'm a knob guy. So I've run the Flex, I've run the Apache, and they worked. I'm 73 years old. I grew up and got my license in 1961 with a radio with knobs. I still like radios with knobs. So what do I own? A bunch of ICOMs. I own the 990 from Kenwood. I own the 890 now, and that's what I happen to run. But that's just, my preference, and that doesn't say anything against a guy who likes to run his radio with a mouse.
Okay, this one's pointed at me, and I'll answer it. Moderator, you have background audio coming through. Well, that's because everybody behind me is breaking down. You're the last webinar running, which is fine. That's not a problem. Okay, I've never seen a 10 dB signal on my Flex 6700 in 9 years. Why should I worry about ADC overload?
Well, then you shouldn't. I assume you say a plus 10 dB. Well, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. It overloads at what it overloads at. Every ADC direct sampling radio has an overload point, whatever it is. They're more or less below 0 dBm, but how it crashes is different. And in the case of the Flex, it doesn't have an overload indicator. Now, everybody else's does, so you can see right off the bat when it's starting to have an issue. But you be grateful. Now, for instance, I can only give you one example where I saw my 7300 overload indicator flash. This was in that 160 contest, 10 meter contest that I had the screenshot on, probably the year before that, actually. So probably 2017. I was running preamp 2, 10 meters, 5-element monoband Yagi, 1,000 feet from the road, pointed towards the Caribbean and South America. And for 20 seconds, the overload light flickered, the OVF light flickered. I actually didn't hear it because it was just flickering. It wasn't like on solid. I think it was a trucker running CB. And of course, the half octave filter in the radio would certainly pass 11 meters. And he might have been running more than 5 watts. Well, he was overloading my 7300 with preamp 2, so that'd be, like minus 25 dBm or something maybe more than that, minus 30, who knows. So it overloaded, but it just barely overloaded. But that was, who knows what the CBer was running, the trucker was running. He might have been running a kilowatt, I don't know. So I just don't see overload either. And if you don't see it, tremendous, because that means you're operating your radio properly. You're not running a preamp when you shouldn't. And if you don't need your attenuator. Now, let me make a comment on Agc Threshold on the Apache and the Flex. They do it differently than we do with all the other brands. In the case of the Flex, you've got something called Agc-T, and you adjust the threshold with that. You don't use an attenuator. It does it some other way. With the Apache, you've got a horizontal line that you move up and down on the screen. And if you want the Agc threshold higher, you move the line up. So it's different, but it accomplishes the same thing. We want the Agc threshold above band noise.
All right, to the station that told me about the background noise, simple solution, my oversight. I'm muting now when I'm done. Okay, next question. How does the Elad FDM Dual compare with the more recent Sdrs?
I tested the Duo a few years ago, and I have a long form report available if you want one by email. It didn't do that well, and it also has no front end unless you bought their optional filtering, because it just, not quite DC to light, but almost. So I know some people are happy with it, and I think if you're up on a mountain peak or something, you're great. But the numbers aren't that great, and I think it was even reviewed in QST. So there was something, I'm trying to remember now, there was something that I asked Bob Allison just recently about the Elad, because one of the measurements didn't make a lot of sense. But I don't consider it a top performer.
Okay. I don't know if you brought this up, but the guy's asking how clean is the FTDX10 transmitter?
I'll have data on that in about a week. So I will expand my chart or my reports. And so if anybody wants to know on the 10, shoot me an email in 2 weeks.
All right, there you go. Opinion, I guess. Which transceiver is better for DX QSOs? The Kenwood, the Kenwood TS9. I guess he meant 990S. There's not a 9905, is there? Or the Flex 6400M.
Well, that's sort of a tongue-in-cheek maybe question. We've got tremendous choices today. They're sensitive enough. They got selectivity. They aren't going to overload very often if you're using your gain right. So you can work DX. I mean, what I remember is I said N2IC uses a pair of 590s. So those are $1,400 radios. When it comes down to DX, where should you spend your next dollar if you've already got your radio? On your antenna. So location, antenna, operator skill, and then radio is the way I rate what's most important. Nothing is more important than the best antenna you can put up where you live, and that may be really limited. I've got 6 towers and 9 HF Yagis. Everybody doesn't have that, or isn't that lucky. So do the best you can with your antenna. Maybe it's an HOA. Maybe the XYL says, I don't want to see the antenna. Well, whatever. So it's sort of silly to say this radio is going to hear something the other one doesn't, because that's really unlikely. I did just hear a read on an email. Someone said that their new radio, and I won't mention which one it was, I'm sure I'm hearing signals that I wouldn't have heard on my old radio. But his old radio was on the operating bench. All he had to do was go back and forth between the two. But he just said, I'm sure I'm hearing stuff that I wouldn't have heard before. That's silliness.
Wow, that many antennas on. Are you east of Denver?
I'm east of Fort Collins, about 40 miles.
Yeah, that's flat. I can see why you'd be out in the open. And that there's a broadcast transmitter out there, and that doesn't bother you, huh? An FM one?
Oh, not near me.
Okay. Well, I seem to remember one out there when I used to live out there. But anyway, okay, the next one. I found a 160 meter SSB receival. Let me say that again. I found that 160 meter SSB receive performance on the 7610 to be atrocious, and that required a large amounts of attenuation and RF gain use. The FTDX 101D and the FTDX 5000 seem to do much better on this band. Are there better radios for different bands, especially 160 and 80 meters? Yeah, 160 and 80 meter bands.
Well, it is unfortunate that the 7300 only has one attenuator. So, and people have come out with options to make an RX receiver, an RX antenna available, things like that. My friend KL7QOW is working all sorts of DX with his 7300, but he's in Alaska, so he probably isn't seeing overload problems. So I've run the 7300 in Colorado on at least 4 160 meter contests, and I never saw overload. So if you're seeing overload, then, or you're having to use the 20 dB attenuator and you're still not copying. See, that's the thing. I could run the 20 dB attenuator and put the Agc threshold way above band noise and still have plenty of sensitivity. So it's funny to hear that, but you hear whatever it's doing, it's doing. In some cases, your superhet is going to be a better choice if you're in some sort of an overload. I mean, was it overloading from a broadcast station? You should look, if you're on 160 and you're seeing overload, first thing I'd go buy is either a DX Engineering high pass filter or the Morgan high pass filter. It used to be sold under the name ICE, ICE, and they went out of business, but the company that made it, Morgan, still sells it. And they kill off the broadcast band. They're slightly different. If the station is on the high end of the broadcast band, the DX Engineering one will provide more attenuation. If they're on the low end of the broadcast band, the Morgan one will provide more attenuation. So I guess the question is, what's overloading it? Because it's probably not signals on 160. But now, if you got a guy 2 miles away on 160 that's 70 over 9, well, that's a problem. Are we there?
Yeah. Yeah, I was trying to see if any new ones came up. It doesn't look like it. Oh, wait a minute. What radio would you consider if I lived in Western Europe and loved 160? I I don't know. I don't. That's what he's asking. What radio would you consider if you lived in Western Europe and loved 160?
Well, I guess I don't know what the QRM out of band is. I try to get a hold of now. Does anybody know if WRTC worked on 160 or did they just work 80 through 10? I'm not sure of that. It'd be interesting to get feedback from operators in Europe. If you said 40 meters, I would say I'd probably pick a superhet with a roofing filter as requiring less tweaking. But on 160, I don't see that as a problem unless there's broadcast, what we call our AM broadcast band. I know they're different over in Europe, and they even got stuff down in the VLF range, but I don't know that I can really answer that. I don't see why it would be an issue. I can give you one example of a station in Europe that used an Orion 2, and he used a Sherwood modified R4C as the sub receiver because he said he could copy better with this pure analog old-fashioned receiver with a roofing filter than he could with the Orion 2. So you just kind of have to try it and see what works.
Which receiver has the best scope or best approach as a spectrum analyzer? In other words, eye candy versus instrument. I'm not sure what that means, but hopefully you do.
Well, for me, the 890S has the best waterfall. Now, I am a search and pounce CW operator for contesting. And the way the waterfall works on the 890S is when I tune, and I may only be tuning 500 hertz or a kilohertz on 160 meters, for example, or even on 10 meters, the whole waterfall shifts left or right, depending on which way I'm tuning. I never lose track of the signal that's in the waterfall. And I've got a history of, 30 seconds or more in the waterfall. And I can just work them bang, 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 like shooting fish in a barrel. With my ICOM, I tune the radio and everything skews off at an angle. I can't run averaging with the ICOM because I lose the signals on the band scope as opposed to the waterfall, which suddenly disappeared because they smeared off at an angle. And with the Yaesu, there's no averaging. And as soon as I transmit, if I could just send NC0B, everything's gone. So that's no good for me, the way I operate. So I think the best, I don't call it eye candy. When I'm working 160 or 10 meters CW, I can sometimes spend on 160 an hour starting from 1800 to 1880, maybe at the first pass when the band is packed. I might spend 2 hours picking up every station that's on the band and seeing, did I work him? If not, work him. Just work 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, almost as fast as running for the first pass. And then, of course, I've worked half of them. So for me, it's not eye candy. And for the Kenwood, it's the best. ICOM second, and the worst on the Yaesu. But that's just the way I operate. There are other ways to use the band scope. I run really narrow spans, 5 kilohertz, 10 kilohertz. Some people like 50 kilohertz, and they have a little crosshair that moves around. But I want to see all the details, like on the spectrum screenshots I showed you. We could see the key clicks. You could see the signals just clear as a bell because I wasn't trying to look at 50 kilohertz or something like that. So personal choice, that's how I do it.
Does it make sense to upgrade from an IC 7300 to a 7610?
If you work only sideband and work only FT8, probably not, assuming you're not having some overload problem like the one gentleman said. I own both. Since I like the APF, audio peak filter and CW, that does not exist on the 7300. I like the lack of mechanical relays clanking away on CW. Even if I'm running semi break-in, I still get clickety-clack. So from a CW standpoint, yes. If you're really, well, you've of course got 2 receivers, and whenever we get the expeditions back, the second receiver is really handy. It's not required, but it's handy. But most people work sideband and FT8. And, obviously a lot of CW operators, but not near as many as sideband. So I'd say if you have an average station and that's your main thing, sideband and FT8, I probably wouldn't. I'd probably stay with the 7300. It's the bargain of the century. because of the $7,300, $1,000, the used market's is a bonanza today. If you want to, if your budget isn't $1,000.
Is the KX3 radio technically an SDR or a hybrid? It also has an optional roofing filter, which is why I'm asking the question.
It's a direct sampling radio. And if you have the roofing filter, it's really a low pass filter at audio. So we're using a 0 IF. So it's not a direct sampling radio. It's a direct conversion. And with the quote roofing filter, which is the low pass audio filter, it performs really well. I've run it in 2 contests on 160. I ran it on Easter Island. I've never used the 8 kc IF option. I never saw any need for that, and that negates the roofing filter. So that's what it is. It's a different architecture, and it works really well considering how tiny it is. It works really well, period. I really enjoyed running it in the contest, and I sure had a blast on Easter Island. Is that the end of the questions?
No, I was answering it and realized I was still muted. The guy's asking, what do you think of the EFHW antenna at 30 feet here in Chicago, in the suburbs?
End-fed half wave?
I think that's what he means.
Okay. The only issue with an end-fed half wave is common mode. And so you'll probably find that the coax is part of your antenna. If that's what you can put up, fine. Are you better off with a center fed, more balanced? That's better, but you do what you can do. Let's say your shack's on the 2nd story and you got a tree out there and you've got a ground rod going down to the ground and the end-fed half wave is what you can put up, that's fine. But just realize the coax, even if you've got a choke balun in there, the coax is probably picking up some signal and radiating some signal.
Yeah, I think that one helps me too, because I use one myself at home. And my problem is I've just got no place to put antennas, and so that's what I use. It's easier to run a wire.
Yeah, when the antenna you have is better than the one you wish you had.
Right. Let's see here. Okay, I think the eye candy refers to the 3D pan adapter of the new Yaesu rigs versus other rigs. Are there any features on the ICOM pan adapter you would change?
Yes, I would change the way it works compared to the Kenwood. I wish it would just slide left or right. I talked to Warren NR0V about the Apache. Could you make that happen? He says, yeah, I could. So I wish that every radio, particularly the waterfall, but that allows you to not only utilize the waterfall without it smearing off at an angle, but you can also run more averaging on the band scope. With the ICOM, if I run averaging and I tune and I lose the waterfall position of the signal, if I can still see the signal on the scope, but if the averaging is there, I have to wait 3 seconds for the averaging to catch up. So yes, I would change the ICOM if I could, but I don't know. I'm not holding my breath.
Gotcha. Let's see here. Yaesu FTDX 101D versus the FTDX 101MP for NECW. Is it worth going for the FTDX 101MP with the extra CW filter?
Well, you can add the extra CW filter in either one of them. I think you have to, for the most part, order it when you place the order any accessories, because for some reason they have to install them in California. Don't understand that. And I think they drop ship it to you. If you want 200 watts and you don't have an amp, then that's exclusive, of course, of the roofing filter question, then the MP sounds fine. And actually, if you put all the options in a D, it's almost the price of an MP. Except you do have the separate power supply that goes in the speaker for the 50 volt PA. But if you're running an amp like I do, I have no use for 200 watts. My TS990S had 200 watts. I never ran it over 80 watts. So the market for the MP is either you get a lot of stuff without having to add it because it comes with it, or you get more power on sideband if you're barefoot.
All right, Yaesu's 991A. Is that still a viable performer, especially front-end performance?
I haven't tested either the 991 or the 991A. I guess I'd look at QST reviews. My concern in the past, until the 101 came along, transmit composite noise on any Yaesu rig was not great. And sometimes the reciprocal mixing was not great either. So until I would be proved otherwise, I'd look at the QST review, but I probably wouldn't go the 101A if I have to make a judgment based on not knowing. But look at the QST review and see if the numbers make any sense.
All righty. I have a 35-year-old TS-140S. How much am I missing compared to today's $1,000 to $1,500 radios? Is it worth the upgrade?
Well, if it works, enjoy it. If you can afford a $1,000 or a $1,700 radio, it's nice with the new features. Noise reduction, certainly noise reduction was probably not available on your radio that's that old. However, I think there's a lot of variation in noise reduction. My Pro 3, I didn't like it. The 7300 and the 7610, I do. On the TS890S, I find it useless. That's at least the noise I have to deal with, which isn't much. So it really comes back to what do you feel you're missing? I mean, the band scope's certainly missing, and I'll never buy another radio without band scope, because it's imperative for me for contesting. If I'm on 10 meters, like we had the 1010 contest QSO party, was it last weekend, the weekend before, or whatever it was, and the band on Friday was good, terrible on Saturday, and Sunday was good. Well, signals are spread out over 70 kilohertz. And how would I see them if I didn't have a band scope? So it really depends on your operating. If you just rag chew with your friends every day on 75 meters, who cares? So it really comes down to what do you need and what do you think you're missing? But for me, no band scope, no radio.
All right. Can you recommend an antenna for the 7300 for an urban environment, New York City, that has no roof access, no balcony, and a south-facing window with semi-clear view of the sky?
Well, that's a toughie. I'll tell you what, W2GM, I think it was, or was it W3? But anyway, it was Dave Rosen, who's unfortunately SK a long time ago. He lived in New York City in a high-rise, and he had a picture window with a metal frame. So I'm assuming it was pretty big. So let's assume it was maybe 10 or 15 feet wide and 4 feet high or whatever it was. And he shunt fed his aluminum frame on his picture window. Now, he had to be clever and know how to shunt feed, but you can look up shunt feed in the antenna handbook. It's kind of like a gamma match. And so I imagine it probably got into some of his neighbors' radios and TVs, but that's where he operated from when he wasn't at the UN station there, whatever the UN something or other UN. That's really difficult, and there are transmit loops, and I'd put them up against your window. MFJ makes one. You can make your own. It'd be easier than probably designing from scratch, shunt feeding your windowsill, your window frame. But if I had to, and I would probably spend more time on the upper bands than the lower bands, these transmitting loops could be put in your window.
I was getting ready to end it, and another question popped up. Let's see what we got here. As someone new to the hobby, where might I? Let me read that real quick. I've got my video on now. We're packing up here. This has been a long webinar, but it's been awesome. Let's see. As someone new to the hobby, where might I find one of those Kenwood radios that you have mentioned, like example, the 890? And what shortcomings should I be looking for when I speak to the seller? Also, what are your best reviewed tuners?
Okay, I don't review tuners. I happen to use Johnson Matchbox, which is nearly as old as I am. I use an ICOM AH4 in my Mobile because I have a homebrew system with a tuner on the roof and a whip with or without a coil and an old 706 Mark II-G. Otherwise, well, I've got some Palstar tuners, which are not the typical one, but when I have two Yagis on the same band, which I do on 10, 15, and 20, in some cases I need to tweak them because they don't tune the same on the linear. So I've got some Palstar. I don't have an auto tuner. I've sort of lost track of some of the part of the other question, and let's make this the last one. So remind me of what I missed.
You said you don't do tuners, and you talked about Kenwood radios. So,
well, so what was the question on the Kenwood radio?
Kenwood radios that you have mentioned, like the 8090. What shortcomings should I be looking for when I speak to the seller?
You mean like buying a used one? I guess. Whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's new, you don't have any, be careful. Unplug your USB port or your serial port when you're not using it. Mine is blown out right now. Some EMP that came in on a rotor cable and went to a rotor controller and went to the rig, and that wasn't good. So if you're in it, now, of course, maybe if you're in California, you don't ever have lightning, but I certainly have lightning where I am. So for CW contesting and sideband contesting, my favorite radio, because of the waterfall, is my 890S. I don't think there's any significant shortcomings other than if it breaks, repair can be a problem. Of course, that may be true of all the brands. I don't know. So hopefully I can get mine fixed. So anyway, let's call it a day. I have to take my wife to the doctor, and it's been great. And I certainly didn't realize I was going to have the pleasure of chatting for another 40 minutes, but I enjoyed it.
Well, I'll tell you what, Rob, even though I wasn't the one that started this, I'm the one that corresponded with you for the webinars. So I appreciate you coming on board. It's pretty noisy back here because we're all shutting down. So 73 to you, to everybody else, thank you for being part of this. I know it lasted a long time, but it's much appreciated.
All right, 73 to everyone.
Bye-bye for all. Yeah, trying to stop it.